Hey everyone, my name is Mike Henry, and this is my Procreate 5 demo for the piece I just call The Crow. So The Crow is basically my favorite movie, and so I thought it'd be cool around Halloween, which is how behind I am on videos now. I thought it'd be cool to do this because I actually dressed as The Crow for Halloween for many years, and I would absolutely put a self-deprecating photo of that on here right now if I had one, but unfortunately I don't have one. If you remember on this channel, way back when, and I'll link it below, in episode 36, which was 4 years ago, I did this piece here, which was like this watercolor stylized take on Eric Draven, the main character of The Crow, played by Brandon Lee, as many of you probably know. And for a long time, I thought that that piece was really successful. I usually don't do likenesses, and I was just really happy with the way it turned out. But I always wondered what would it have looked like if I had fully rendered it, because when I choose these different styles, every time you choose one thing, you're saying no to everything else, right? So I thought that it'd be cool to do a rendered version for Halloween. I did later do another Halloween piece, which will be the next video that I post, but since I technically did two, let's do the first one first. So the first step of this is taking the old file and actually excavating it, and trying to figure out what was going on in the original. So you can see here that I start by taking some of the same colors and starting to kind of edit them away. Because my thought here was that I was going to do an exact recreation of the original watercolor, but I was just going to do it with a more rendered style. Then what you could see right there, why the image suddenly got so small, was when I did the original, that was old Procreate, old iPad Pros. I mean, we're talking 4 years ago. So I thought, let's go ahead and make this a lot bigger, actually. So once I decided, you could see I was starting to cut the head out and make it separate from the neck. I was like, we should just go big. So I resized my canvas to be much, much larger. Double the size. So this is 8 by 12, 8 inches by 12 inches at 300 dpi, and the other one was 4 inches by 6 inches. So this is much larger, and since the lines are going to get completely blown out by resizing it, but the lines aren't going to be there in the final. So I thought, okay, screw it, let's just do that. Let's blow the whole thing up. And once I decided to do that, I kind of knew that this was going to be a bigger reworking where I wasn't going to be replicating the original watercolor, and I needed to figure out what I was going to do. Also, Eric and the Crow here actually take up more real estate on the page than the original did. They were a little bit smaller, a little bit more to the left, and here they're filling the space a little bit more. So while I'm going through and I'm doing all of these flats, the thing I'm processing in the back of my mind is, what the hell is my background going to be? I just don't know at this point. Is it going to be white like the other one? Is it going to be something completely different? I just don't know. So at this point, all I'm doing is I'm trying to reflat it, and in the background think about what will my background be. The flatting process here is going to be super standard, but the actual rendering is the same as far as my methodology. However, instead of using a brown like a tan or even like a purple or some sort of color for my shadows, I actually just use black. Then by adjusting the opacity of that black and doing other things too, because there's going to be bounce light and stuff that's going to kind of affect that, I'm trying to go for a lighting scheme that more resembles the actual movie, because the movie, if you watch it, has a lot of heavy blacks. It's kind of like a Mignola movie before that was a thing, with these just super drenched blacks and this blocking and all that kind of stuff. So that's kind of what I was going to go for. Now, I won't say that I set out to make this an exact replica of any moment from the movie. Obviously, you can see this is just kind of Eric standing here, and he's got this crow on his shoulder, and I thought to myself casually, kind of that uses a lot of black, so let's use black instead of saturating this thing with color. And then kind of one thing led to another conceptually, until the idea was, okay, let's find a scene from the movie and just kind of give the impression of that in the background. And that's where we end up arriving by the time the whole thing is over. But there was no moment where I was trying to make this look like a cell from the movie, or a single frame from the movie, I should say. So the hair here is broken up into a couple of chunks, and then the rest of the flatting process is super straightforward. So let's actually just zoom ahead here. By the way, I wish the music in the background for this could have been the Crow soundtrack, since it's such a killer soundtrack, but we're gonna go with the usual. jazz stuff, because why not? You'll notice, even though his face gets covered in paint, I still give his face all of the skin tone variation that he actually would have underneath that paint. And that's because there are different phases in the movie where Eric has, like, the makeup's kind of worn off a little, or it's starting to fade, because he puts it on at the beginning of the movie, basically, and then it just kind of wears off as the movie goes on. So I wanted to kind of hit, like, let's call it mid-movie, where it's starting to kind of fade, so you can see a little bit of what's going on underneath his skin. You can see he's got a scar over his nose, and you can see, well, here you can see that his irises are two different colors because one eye is slightly lighter than the other one, but then by the time all the lighting gets put in there, you can't actually see that. But, you know, sometimes we put stuff in there that's in there, and we know it's in there, and you might not be able to see it, but at least we did our due diligence. One thing I want to highlight here is I'm adding in the ring. Way back when I first posted this, again, that was 4 years ago, I'm a big fan of The Crow, and when I posted it, somebody online was like, you forgot the ring. And I was like, oh, shit. I mean, I could always say that, oh, this is before he got the ring, but if he's got all those, like, all the duct tape kind of, or electrical tape around his waist and stuff, it's definitely after he got the ring back, so kind of fucked that up. So this is a little bit of redemption for me, bringing the ring back in. If you're not familiar with the movie, the ring is fairly important. It's not as important as, say, in the movie The Lord of the Rings, but it is an important moment for the character, an important keepsake of the characters, and he wears it on a necklace around his neck, and it changes hands a couple times, and that's important, and the fact that he has it is important, and I totally forgot it in the original. So anyways, it's back now, so redemption, here we are. We are currently rendering the AO pass on the Crow. So I recently had somebody, I've had a lot of people ask this, and I have shown a little bit of my smudge technique in the past, but I had somebody kind of ask, like, can you please highlight how you do this? I don't have a lot of time to record this video today, and I think that there are some other videos that actually have, there's some other pieces that are coming down the line that have a better way to showcase it, so I am going to do that. In fact, what I may even do is just do a separate breakout video. I don't do that often, but it sounds like maybe that's something that people are interested in. So for those of you who aren't aware, when I say the word AO, this is like a technique. This is a thing that happens in real life, but it's definitely a technique in painting that has taken hold a lot more strongly in the last 10 years or so than it previously had. I'm not saying that this is something that artists didn't know about. It's just that this methodology, I think, has really become a lot more widespread. So AO, it means ambient occlusion, and ambient occlusion is essentially the occlusion of ambient light, which that probably doesn't explain that much, but the way that it translates in its simplest form is when you're painting, you want to have these little pockets where bounce light can't really get to, and it's usually a soft lighting that's kind of giving you a little bit of a form to the character, as well, or in this case character, as well as capturing like these deep pockets where no light can bounce to. It is, in my case, not hyper accurate. I don't go for a very accurate AO, but I do have a logic and a methodology to the way I kind of do it. That's why I usually don't call it an AO pass, even if it does meet the criteria. I usually call it more of like a form shadow pass, because this is the pass where I go across all of the flats and I'm adding in essentially like shadows that emphasize the topology of the figures. This is lighting agnostic in a lot of ways. True AO would probably not be entirely lighting agnostic. I'm not a light scientist, but that's kind of the way I treat it. It's as if the figure is just like completely neutrally lit kind of all around them. And then later we get into the directional lighting. So what I'm doing here, the way I'm actually applying this is I'm using my turpentine brush, which is in my brush set linked below, which is free. I am using the turpentine brush to brush in where I want sort of like the start of these shadows to be, the like main globule of the shadow. And then I'm using the smudge tool, also set to the same turpentine brush, to then push and pull that paint in a way that I want it. And it's going to be softer for softer forms. It's going to be a little more harsh for harsher, more like faceted forms. And then I'm also going to make sure that I'm pocketing some darkness in like little recesses here or there. One of the main areas where you'll see me do that on this piece will be underneath his like chin and jawline and hair, where his neck meets those sections, because that's usually an area where lots of shadow is. So that's kind of the method and logic. There are videos that I have posted where I show a little bit of my smudging process, and because I have historically been bad at like really highlighting that and making it like an easy resource to just jump into, it is in there somewhere. It's actually from not that long ago, so if you look at videos, let's say over the last year or so, you'll find it. But that's kind of the thought process of how I do this. Meaning with the smudge, lay down the paint with the turpentine, smudge it around with the turpentine set to smudge, and then try to emphasize the shapes the way I want them to read. So while this goes on, let's actually speed it up and we'll get to the next stage. Also, you'll notice here that while I'm doing this pass, I'm doing it with the makeup off. That's because I'm trying to kind of get a sense for what the clearest image is, so that I make sure that I'm not getting like, I'm not kind of like mispainting because I'm getting distracted by additional kind of ornamentation, I guess you could say. In fact, sometimes I would even turn off the darkening around his eyes and the blush on his nose just to make sure that I'm dealing with it as plain as possible. If I'm thinking of this like it's a real object, whether or not this man's face has paint on it, it's going to get lit in a similar way. Yes, there's going to be some reduction in the subsurface scattering because of the paint. Maybe some of the light plays a little bit differently, but what I mean is the topology of it doesn't change. And if I start getting a little too distracted by the black around his eyes and his lips or the white on his face, I could end up painting something wrong. So what I do here is I'm painting it as though it is just a bare face, which I'm realizing how much he looks like Trent Reznor right now. Holy shit. Didn't intend for that, but that's funny since Nine Inch Nails is on the soundtrack. But anyways, then once I flip the paint on, it should all hold true. Everything that I painted should still work, basically. So now we're going to do the hard shadow. You can see at the start of that underneath the crow's beak, and then there's going to be some cast shadow coming off of Eric the man onto the crow, back by the tail, and I'll also be adding a little bit of additional color variation to the crow itself here. You'll see the beak will get like a little bit of a darkening, just so that I can get like a little bit of color blocking there, and so that that crow will read a little bit better. Now we're on to more of the figure of the character. So you can see here, especially now that we're kind of moving off of the bird, which is really dark, and onto the dude, we've got black here. We're just working with straight black. There will be some adjustments that I make as time goes on, because I don't want it to be entirely blotted out with black, but the only adjustments that we really make is lightening it with opacity a little bit. We reduce the opacity just a touch. I went back in and reviewed my Procreate file just a little bit, and there are some little additional shadows that I add, like underneath the nose and stuff, that ended up taking on a little bit of a brown hue, but it's really dark still. And that was, I'm assuming I did that because it's been 2 months now since I painted this. I assume that I just did that because I already had that color, or I was working really fast or something, and it wasn't something that was going to disrupt anything too much. Using that warm color, but it's still so dark, is almost no different than just like lowering the opacity of a black layer. So that's kind of why that comes in. But as you can see right now, we're just working with black. Now, what were the challenges of working with black? Well, for one, clarity is a big thing. I didn't design this piece with the color blocking or the shadow blocking in mind. So as I was laying in the shadow, I was trying to make sure that I was applying the appropriate shadow that would look like the lighting is correct, while at the same time making sure that details that I wanted to read still read. Now, obviously, I mentioned earlier that you don't see the one eye. It is true that that eye gets just completely blotted out with shadow at one point. I don't think that it actually ruins anything. I think that if you were just looking at this as an illustration, there's no problem with that whatsoever. If you're looking at it as the artist who made it and wants to make sure all the little choices that you make and all the little details shine through, that's just like you got to let that die kind of thing, right? Sometimes you're trying to make sure that you are representing everything the right way, and you just kind of have to say like, well, that's the way the lighting falls, so that's the way the lighting falls. You can say, no, I'm an auteur and I'm making a decision here that that's an important thing that I want people to see, and then you go in and you do some little tricks here and there. In fact, I finished a piece last night where I deliberately did the lighting incorrectly on a part of this character's face because this character has a huge horn coming off of their head, and I didn't want their face to just be covered up with a shadow. So there's things like that sometimes that you just do because it's an illustration and you have control over it. So we're laying in all of these big heavy shadows. Let's speed things up and get to the next stage. Something you'll see pop in here real quick is some bridge support, and by support I mean in the shadow department we're going to really emphasize that plane of his nose, also the his upper lip, so that we can get some more dimension out of that. I also throw in just a little bit of helper shadows in a couple of other areas to really emphasize like his deltoid. Here we're going to add the hot subsurface scattering off of the light hit by the shadow. We're just going to paint it in as red and then lower its opacity. And now here is when we're trying to solve the background. You saw me flip on the old background for a second, and I deleted it, get those layers back, those precious Procreate layers. And then I looked up a scene from when the crow is in Fun Boy's apartment. And while, again, this is not accurate because this would have happened the way he's dressed, it's post Fun Boy. But I liked the lighting, and I felt like it was like very The Crow looking. So I wanted to go in and get this kind of like window in the background with some of this like brown bleeding happening around the outside of it. Get a little bit of messy painterly noise in that window so that it isn't just like a big flat field of white. And that's kind of like what I wanted to do to try to evoke that moment or that vibe from the movie. Now the question comes in is, how much does the environment impact the lighting of the character? Or is this like a stage, or is this whatever? So what I decided to do is take that back window and apply some lighting on the bird and on the man from that. And then as time goes on, you'll see that I add some deepening of the shadows on the distant side of the character, and then we add in just like a heavy-ass rim light. Now, a movie from that era, movies in general, but a movie from that era would have probably had a rim light established in certain moments, but it's not constant. I just figured, hey, everybody loves a good rim light. Why not do a rim light, pop out some of this form a little bit? And so that's ultimately where we go with this. Something you'll also notice here is that there is no highlighting going on in the shirt. Like, we don't have a value higher than the base flat, and that's because I wanted to maintain just overall darkness and try to represent the materials a little accurately. So we've got some shine happening in the hair. We got a little bit of shine in on his Adam's apple and on the bird, but we don't actually go in and add any additional shine detail on his shirt because it just wouldn't get it, and I felt like it was better to keep all of the attention in other places and get those materials a little bit more accurate. We will actually put it into the electrical tape as well, just to make sure, again, that we're getting those materials accurate. As accurate as this stylized piece will get them. One thing that I mentioned earlier was the idea of like you put work into something and then you end up covering it up with lighting. One of the big aspects of this movie and of this illustration is trying to capture that darkness that it should have. Now, if we capture that darkness, though, of course, we're going to be hiding some details. And since we are building this, we didn't do like a color key in the beginning where we were going to really establish what everything was going to look like. So as we're putting work into this, we put work into something that might get eventually covered up by a shadow. You can either be cool with that, which I was cool with that. I mean, this is just an illustration that I'm doing for fun. But if you want to actually previs that stuff so that you're making sure that you're not going to put too much work into something maybe that shouldn't get that kind of work, you could do that with a color key right off the bat. You could really plan out your lighting and figure out right away, like, oh, I don't have to put detail into XYZ. That's a really good way to do it, especially in a production setting where you're trying to save time, or if you're working with a client and you want to make sure that what you're going to ultimately create is close to their expectations. Again, when you're making an illustration for yourself, you just make all those calls. Okay, now we're adding in this sort of like support shadow. This is what I do sometimes. I actually do this on all of the like monster series and a few other pieces, where even though we're going for this painterly look, we go back in later with a big soft airbrush and we're just punching up a little bit of the lighting so that we can actually have it be a little bit more directional. So we've got these cast shadows, we've got this AO giving us our basic forms. And now this is establishing the dark side of the moon, basically, right? Like, just because the character is lit with these other techniques doesn't mean that there also wouldn't be a dark side to the character because the light's coming from a direction. The cool thing about getting that dark side and covering up some of our little details here or there is that we can now bang in one of these super punchy rim lights and give it just like not only a lot of moodiness, but it also emphasizes those forms so strongly and gives us just like a really fun, punchy, nice look. So that's what we're going for here. So that side's a little darker probably than it should be. I don't remember actually if I adjusted or not, but it doesn't matter because it ends up giving us this really nice rim light, which is just fun to paint. It's one of those things that it's like, it falls into that category of the last 10%, last 5% of the work, but it makes up 20% or 50% or well, I don't know percentages of the fun and the excitement and the joy that the viewer has comes from something so simple, right? So the hardest part of this illustration is actually probably the AO pass, because it's just the most tedious and you're going in and defining all these forms. The shadows and the rim lights and all these little bells and whistles, the cast shadows I should say, that's all the easy stuff. At least for me, that's just kind of the way I look at it. So throwing in this rim light at the end is just a fun, easy win. Now, would a cotton shirt get as sharp of a rim light as I'm plugging in right here? Maybe, maybe not. Probably not. But who cares? The idea here is that this falls into the it's an illustration bucket. So we're keeping it pretty sharp on the face and on the hair and on the skin and on the bird, but then we're really trying to dull that down a bit on the shirt so that we can again communicate these different materials. When we get down to the electrical tape, we're gonna make it punchier again as well, just to capture that shine. So now we're going to get just some other tweaky stuff. This is me just kind of going through and saying like, oh, this should be a little this should be a little that. Sometimes you'll see me turn off layers because I'm trying to understand some of the information that I've got underneath. But then what we'll do here is just like a little bit of a slight stylish slash stylistic element, and it's that kind of like gray outline that you can see kind of going in right now around the bird, and then we're also using it to punch out that shape of the tail as it's breaking the square, and that's kind of cool because light sometimes does follow the form like that outside, but it's also more just like a stylistic element so that we can emphasize the bird and not have it get lost. Also notice that we threw some chromatic aberration on using the new chromatic aberration filter from Procreate, which is just the standard one, not the shifted one or whatever. I do sometimes still like using the old way that I would do chromatic aberration, so you might still see me do that occasionally, but for now, I thought this would be totally fine. Gets us a little bit of a filmic quality, and we could do a lot to really make this look like overly filmic, but that's just not really what I'm going for. We add a little bit of that like ground bloom, a little bit of some back bloom, some noise, and we call it a day. Right there is the finished version of the illustration. I really like the way it came out. I like these sort of baby steps that you can kind of take as an artist to try little things here or there and use an illustration as the excuse to do it. I have used black shadows in the past, of course, but doing it in such a heavy way with the methodology that I've been using more frequently over the last year or so has been really fun. Here's the original just for comparisons, which I still really like. I think they have two very different qualities, and then jump back to the new version just so you can check that out. So yeah, I'm pretty happy with how it came out. Hope you like it too. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please consider hitting like and subscribe and share it with your friends, and I'll see you on the next one. And if you are looking for me on the internet, these are the places where you can find me.